Hello, and welcome to Hadassah Magazine Presents, a program and podcast for those who love Hadassah Magazine and want more, and for those who have never heard of the magazine and are looking for stimulating conversations with acclaimed Jewish authors, thinkers, celebrities, and culinary stars. I'm your host, Lisa Hostein, the executive editor of Hadassah Magazine. I'm honored to be in conversation today with Matti Friedman, an award-winning Israeli journalist whose newest book, Out of the Sky, Heroism and Rebirth in Nazi Europe, dives deep into the mystifying story of how a group of idealistic, passionate young Zionists risked their lives to try to save Jews from the Nazi genocide. That mission included Hannah Senesh, author of the iconic poem Eli, Eli, and one of the most revered heroines in 20th century Jewish history. And it sparks important questions for our own times. It's perhaps fitting that we are meeting directly after Yom HaZikaron, Israel's Memorial Day, and Yom Ha'atzmaut, Israel's Independence Day, celebrating the Jewish state's 78th birthday, and a week after Yom HaShoah, the Holocaust Remembrance Day. We live in challenging, complicated, and anxious times, and all of us who love Israel worry about its future on so many levels. Speaking with Matti today, we have the opportunity to both reflect on the past and seek a thread that connects the past, present, and future. Thanks to all of you in the audience for joining us today. If this is your first Hadassah Magazine Presents program, a special welcome. And I hope you take the time to learn more about Hadassah and the work that the largest Jewish women's organization in the United States does to heal those in Israel through its two world-class hospitals in Jerusalem and its youth aliyah villages for at-risk children, as well as through its advocacy in the United States on matters relating to Israel, anti-Semitism, women's empowerment, and women's health, including reproductive rights and conflict-related sexual violence. We'd like to thank the generous supporters who enabled Hadassah's hospitals to immediately transition into emergency mode when the war with Iran and Hezbollah began nearly 2 months ago, putting up additional fortification, adding 40 beds and equipment in an underground parking garage for additional capacity, and providing the mental health support not only for the victims of missile strikes, but for the millions affected by the war, including Hadassah staff who have been heroes in this stressful environment. There is a significant need to finish, equip, and expand the underground fortified facilities, never knowing what might come next. So please consider an extra donation if you've already contributed, or perhaps a first one if you're new to the organization. All donations are valued. And if you're not already a member, please consider joining so you can stay informed about Hadassah's work and also enjoy the magazine, which is free with membership, as well as all the wonderful programming the magazine and the rest of Hadassah provides. Links for both giving and membership are in the chat box. We welcome audience questions throughout the conversation. Please be sure to write them in the Q&A. The chat is where we will disseminate information to you. And be sure to stay tuned to the very end when I will announce the 2 lucky winners of a complimentary copy of Out of the Sky. And now for a fuller introduction to our featured guest. Matti is the author of 5 works of nonfiction that have been translated into more than a dozen languages. In addition to Out of the Sky, his titles include Who by Fire, Leonard Cohen in the Sinai, which was selected in 2022 as one of the year's best books by Vanity Fair and was adapted as a successful stage show in Israel. Spies of No Country, Secret Lives at the Birth of Israel, which won the Natan Book Award in 2019, and Pumpkin Flowers, A Soldier's Story of a Forgotten War in 2016, which was chosen as the New York Times notable book and was selected as one of the year's best by many outlets, including Amazon, Booklist, Mother Jones, and the Globe and Mail. A former Associated Press correspondent, Friedman's work has appeared in The Atlantic, the New York Times, and Smithsonian Magazine. He currently is a columnist for the Free Press. Matti was born in Toronto and lives in Jerusalem with his family. Welcome, Matti, to Hadassah Magazine Presents. Thank you so much for being here. Your book is so powerful and captivating. I couldn't put it down. I actually studied a lot about Zionist history over the years, but never really dug into this story. I just knew the song Eli, Eli, which we sang at Havdalah at Jewish summer camp, not only on Yom HaShoah. I highly recommend the book to all. So before we delve into the book, Matti, I want to ask you to describe the mood, both for you personally and communally in Israel over the past week, as we marked the 3 Yamim, Yom HaShoah, Yom HaZikaron, and Yom Ha'atzmaut.
First of all, thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be with you. I wish we could do it in person, but we'll have to make do with Zoom. I think for many of us, the last week has been a very kind of strange in between time. As someone said on Yom Ha'atzmaut, it feels like we've been living Yom HaZikaron, Yom HaShoah, and Yom Ha'atzmaut for the past 2.5 years. It's just been a very kind of intensely emotional time where we're constantly dealing with the military losses, and we're constantly dealing with grief, and we constantly kind of feel the resurgence of a time that it isn't the 1930s, but I think it's easier for us to understand the 1930s right now than it has been, than it was before October 7th. And I think many of us are very conscious of our independence and how fragile it is. So it feels like it's always Yom Ha'atzmaut and always Yom HaZikaron. The last week, I think, has been characterized by this, feeling that we're just coming out of this very scary episode with Iran, where much of Israel was under rocket fire. It's not quite done. The north of Israel is still under rocket fire. Just about an hour ago, there was another barrage fired from Lebanon at the north. So we're in this kind of in between time between war and maybe some, I don't want to say peace, but something that isn't war. And these days that mark important episodes in our history. But I think we're all very aware that our history is not over, and that we're very much living it every day.
Which is part of the reason why this book is so important and timely. And of course, Hannah Senesh and the others on that fateful mission back in 1944 don't technically qualify among the fallen for the actual state of Israel, but we certainly should think of them in that context of dying for the Zionist cause, right?
Sure. I mean, one of the funny things about these heroes is that these are some of the most famous Israeli heroes. So if you drive around Israel, you'll see kibbutzim that are named for the heroes of the mission. Hannah Senesh is the most famous name, and there's a kibbutz named for Hannah called Yad Hannah, but there's a kibbutz called Netzer Sereni, which is named for a great Italian character, Enzo Sereni, who's the commander of the mission. Lavot Chaviva or Givat Chaviva, which is a name that might be familiar to some of you, named for Chaviva Reich, one of the heroes of the mission, and there are others. So these are really famous Israeli heroes, except they weren't Israelis, as you're pointing out, because this mission happens 4 years before the state of Israel exists. The people in this mission had never heard the word Israeli. That word was not in use. They were, I guess, Jews. They would have called themselves Zionists. Maybe they would have referred to themselves as Palestinians, confusingly, because they lived in British Mandate Palestine. So they become among the first, fallen of Israel. But their project precedes Israel, and in many ways leads to the creation of the state of Israel. Or certainly, the state of Israel is founded in 1948, in large part inspired by actions like the one undertaken by Hannah Senesh and her comrades.
Mm. So when did you first learn about her and what motivated you to write this book now?
Well, I grew up in Toronto, and if you have a Jewish education, I don't even know if you can remember the first time you heard the name Hannah Senesh. I can't put my finger on it. I must have heard about her in elementary school. We must have sung Eli Eli at Bialik Hebrew Day School in Toronto. I can't remember doing it, but we must have. Eli Eli is probably the most famous song in modern Hebrew, or certainly one of them. So I must have heard her name. And it's one of those names that you always know, kind of like Davy Crockett for an American, or even George Washington. It's just a name that's around. You get that it's important when someone asks you, like, what can you tell us about this person? You don't necessarily know very much. If you're a New Yorker, Lafayette. There's lots of things called Lafayette. Who was Lafayette? We don't really know. And Hannah Senesh is similar, although of course she's more recent. So I kind of always had a sense that there was this heroic character, but if you had asked me a few years ago what she did, I would not have been able to tell you beyond saying that she parachuted into Europe to save the Jews or something. The mission, of course, is much, much more complicated. And when I started actually researching it about 4 years ago, about a year before October 7th, so yeah, about 3.5, 4 years ago, I realized that my knowledge of this mission and the facts of the mission were two very, very different things. And I spent a long time in the archives and reading old memoirs and trying to, resuscitate the story. I spent a long time trying to reconcile the gap between this very vague picture I had and the actual complicated, fascinating, very confusing and strange mission of 1944.
So it's interesting because in setting up this story, some of whom, as you said, became very mythic. You write that you wonder whether you have the right to, quote, rescue them from myth and amnesia only to fit their story to my selfish specifications. Very puzzling phrasing. What do you mean by that?
So I write nonfiction. This is my fifth nonfiction book, and what I usually write is this is a true story. That's just what a nonfiction writer likes to tell readers, and I was writing that in this case, and I realized that um, I kind of had this feeling that these characters were looking over my shoulder as I was writing, because these are incredibly literate characters. Hannah Senesh is not just the daughter of a playwright and a novelist, which is a detail that's kind of played down in her Zionist biography, but she's the daughter of an important Hungarian writer. And so she's clearly a literary character. She writes a diary. She reads an incredible number of books, which we know because she keeps a list of every book she reads from age 12. And we have the list. So she's like she's a bookworm. She's a theater kid. She's a really literary character, but the others are too. And so Sereni, the Italian who I mentioned, he had already written a book by the time of the mission. Another book of his was published posthumously. And the other characters are also writing and reading. And I just had this feeling that these literary characters were breathing down my neck and might not agree that my version of their story was true. They would be looking at my manuscript and saying, who does this guy think he is? He's writing some story about our mission, but he never met us. So I decided I would hedge it a bit and explain what I'm doing. What I'm doing is I'm telling a story about this mission. The phrasing that I ultimately struck on, I think, goes something like, this is a true account of my journey into their story. But I'm telling my story about the mission. I kind of see a kind of narrative here, and I'm using these characters to tell the narrative, which I hope accurately reflects events. But that sentence that you just quoted reflects a kind of hesitation that I have about claiming that this is a true and definitive version. Maybe 10 years ago, I would have written without hesitation, this is a true story. Everything I'm saying is true. I'm completely objective. Don't question my credentials to write the story. But I think I'm older and I'm more experienced, and I'm a bit more suspicious of my own tricks. So I just felt like maybe apologizing for a moment and saying, okay, I'm going to rescue these people from having been forgotten or misunderstood or turned into two-dimensional characters. But what am I doing? I'm also using them to tell a story that I want to tell. So it's not that I didn't do it. Obviously, I did. You read the book, but I did insert a bit of kind of a question mark about my own intentions here.
And why did you want to do it, especially now? Why was this story compelling for you?
So the meaning of the book changed for me as I wrote it. I mean, the main event that happened while I was working on this book was, of course, October 7th. So I tried to recreate my own headspace about a year or so before October 7th when I started researching the book. And I think that I had a sense that Israel has kind of lost its story. We no longer have a single coherent story that we're telling ourselves. We are often asked why our PR is so bad or why we're doing such a poor job explaining ourselves to the world. And that is absolutely true. We do a terrible job of explaining ourselves to the world, including in the past 2.5 years when we could have really used a coherent story. But even before October 7th, there was a sense that Israel has kind of become a bunch of competing stories, and we don't really have that, that kind of unifying narrative that Israel once had. So I thought it would be interesting to kind of peel away 80 very complicated years of history and all the right and left stuff and Netanyahu and the settlements and the wars, and just like peel away all of that and go back to the core of the Zionist story, which in many ways is Hannah Senesh. It's that story of these young Jews who escape the Holocaust. They make it to the land of Israel to relative safety, and they volunteer to parachute back into the Holocaust. So that's kind of the nucleus of our story, and it's interesting to go back to that in a time where our story has become very complicated and maybe non-existent. So I think that was kind of what I was thinking, that I would try to just go back to the kind of the original story and try to view it from the eyes of our time, not with the intention of demythologizing the heroes. I don't find that very interesting. I know that we're in a time where you're supposed to kind of shatter myths, and no one believes in heroes anymore, and everyone's always debunking stuff all the time. But I find that quite boring, and I'm not trying to shatter the myth. I'm trying to understand the myth with my own eyes, but my conclusion ends up being that the characters are actually much more impressive than the myth. After October 7th, I think it changed, and I found myself living in a time that made it much easier to understand my characters. And I think that was surprising to me. I'm not saying that this is the 1930s, and I'm not saying that we're in the Holocaust or approaching the Holocaust. This is a different time, but I think before October 7th, it was difficult for us to understand a world like theirs where there are no good options for Jews, and where everything seems very dark and the way forward seems unclear. And when I moved to Israel from Toronto in 1995, I thought I was moving between two Jewish solutions. So I thought liberal democracy had basically solved the Jewish problem in the West. And Canadian Jews, American Jews, everything was great, and we were, you could live there if you wanted to. I didn't want to for my own reasons. I moved to Israel, which, in my understanding, was a solution to the problem of the Jews in the Middle East. I thought Zionism had, there were a few kinks left to work out, but I thought it was basically a solution. And I think October 7th shows that neither is a solution, that the Jewish problem has not been resolved, and that liberal democracy has, in fact, not solved the Jewish conundrum in the West, which is becoming worse. And certainly in Israel on October 7th, we were forced to grapple with images that looked like images from the 1940s or the 1930s, or Kishinev in 1903, where the Cossacks are rampaging through the village and, kidnapping children and raping women. And that was not supposed to happen in the state of Israel, founded after 1948. So I found myself inhabiting a world that was more similar to the world of the heroes. And then it became more interesting for me to think about how to respond to a world like that. What do you do when we have no good options? And 1944 is obviously a moment with much worse options than the options that we have now. But there's a darkness that's tangible in the world right now that is reminiscent of their darkness. And I think many of us should be asking what we're supposed to do. What do you do in a situation like this? And our heroes offer us one answer, which is the Zionist answer, which is that when you're faced with darkness and when you're faced with catastrophe, you act. You don't, go into bed and pull the covers over your head. You act, even if the chances of success are very, very slim.
There's a lot there that we'll continue to unpack. But before we do, can you give the basic outlines of the mission to parachute into Nazi-occupied Europe? How did it come about, and what did it entail?
Sure. So, as I mentioned, the mission happens in 1944. And so this is a bit more, it's like a year and a half before the end of the Second World War. It's a very dark moment. Most of the Jews in Europe are already dead. The Jews of Hungary, which is the center of this mission, are still alive. At the beginning of 1944, they're the last Jewish community in continental Europe that's mostly intact, but not for long. And the Zionist movement cooperates with the British Empire in creating this operation. So what's the idea? The British need agents in Central Europe who speak useful Central European languages like Hungarian, Romanian, Serbo-Croat, Slovak. They need to get people into these occupied countries so they can rescue downed Allied pilots who've been shot down behind enemy lines, also POWs who've managed to escape somehow, and they need to get these people back to Allied lines. The office in charge of doing this is a branch of British military intelligence called MI9, which is not one of the famous MIs. We know MI5 and MI6, but there was also an MI9 that was in charge of escape and evasion. And a British officer who had been active in Palestine understood that the Jews had the perfect people for these missions, because the Jews, he understood, often have double identities, which is something that's worth thinking about. The idea of double identity is something that comes very naturally to Jewish people. Many of us have more than one name. My Hebrew name is Matti. My English name is Matthew. That's pretty standard for a Jewish person. I speak a few different languages, which is still common. It was more common in the 30s and 40s. So he understood that there's this population, the Zionist population in Palestine, which in many ways was a real pain in the neck for the British because they're constantly rebelling against the British. But they also have double identities, which can be useful for intelligence purposes. You have Jews from Iraq who can be Arabs, and you have Jews from Germany who seem German, and you can use these people for intelligence purposes. And there are a few other really interesting projects that take advantage of Jewish double identity on behalf of the British Empire. I wrote about another one which is called the Arab section, which was an operation that used Arabic-speaking Jews as spies, and it eventually becomes the Mossad. So this is all going on in the 1940s. So that's as far as the British are concerned. As far as the Zionist movement is concerned, they're cooperating with this British mission essentially to get Zionist agents into Europe. So if they can, save a few British pilots, they're happy to do so, but that's not what's really motivating them. They understand that there's a catastrophe going on in Europe. The Zionist movement, which is based on the idea of action, is completely helpless to do anything about the Holocaust. Millions of Jews are being murdered. There's no way to stop it. They feel that they need to do something. And the British have a way of getting people into Europe, which the Jews can't do because the Jews don't have an air force. Of course, it's hard to remember that time, but the Jews have no army, no air force, no state. The Jews are completely helpless. And if they want to get into Europe, they're going to have to join the British army, wear a British uniform, get on a British bomber, and parachute into Europe on behalf of the British. So that's what they decide to do. So that's the mission, essentially. The British think that they're using Jews as agents to help rescue pilots. The Jews think that they are using the British in order to get their people into Europe to save Jews and fight the Nazis. Whether any of that was really possible is a good question, and it's one of the questions that I ask in the book, which concludes ultimately that the mission was something else entirely. But that, at least on the surface, is what everyone thinks is going on in 1944.
Mm. And you do talk about how there are really conflicting goals here, and it's not really clear where the parachutists themselves and the Zionists understood that there were conflicting goals or really had a different perspective on what was really expected of them. So it seems like it was very confusing, right? Like there were cross purposes going on.
Totally. The motivations for the mission are very hard to understand. And there's a funny moment in Tel Aviv before the parachutists leave. I guess I should say we're talking about 32 people who will parachute into Europe. So we're not talking about, 10,000 parachutists who are going off. These are 32 people who are going to be dropped in pairs into about 6 occupied countries in Central Europe. So the Zionist leadership convenes the parachutists in a secret meeting in Tel Aviv. And at this meeting, the leaders are going to reveal to the parachutists what the real mission is. So the parachutists are in British uniforms. They've sworn allegiance to the king, but the Zionist movement is not really a big fan of the British Empire. They just hate the British less than they hate the Germans. The British at this time, we have to remember, are preventing Jewish refugees from escaping to the land of Israel, which is the only address for them. So they're condemning hundreds of thousands or millions of people to death, and the Jews are, understandably very upset about that. But these people are now British soldiers, and the Zionist leaders are going to explain to them what the real mission is. And Ben-Gurion is at this meeting just as an indication of how important this was for the Zionists. He's the future prime minister. Golda is there. Eliyahu Golom, who's the commander of the Haganah, the pre-IDF, he's there. So it's a big deal, and each leader gets up and tells the parachutists something completely different. They all present a completely different mission. And if you've ever been in a room full of Jews, that's familiar. Like everyone thinks that they're the leader, and everyone has a completely different plan. So that's kind of what it's like. One of the leaders says your job is to organize military uprisings like the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which had happened a year before. That was the Zionists, like the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which was led by Zionists, not coincidentally. That's the kind of thing they wanted. Another Zionist leader said, no, there's no point in rebelling against the Wehrmacht because you'll just be killed and it won't achieve anything. Just help the Jews survive until the Allies can arrive at the end of the war. Another leader, and this is Ben-Gurion, says, actually, your goal is not even really to do anything during the war, but to make sure that the day the war ends, all of the displaced Jews in Europe start moving toward Israel. We need a human wave filling the trains, filling the rivers. This is what he says, and showing the world that the Jews are demanding a homeland in the land of Israel, and that is your job. And so these are completely different jobs. And what they have in common is that they're all impossible for 32 people who are being dropped into the world war in Europe. So the Zionist mission doesn't make sense as a military mission, and it begs the question of what exactly is going on and how the parachutists actually understand what they're being sent to do. They're very confused after this meeting, but none of them drop out.
Hmm. And in the files that you accessed in terms of evaluating these different potential candidates for this mission, Hannah ranks really high. So how is it that she became involved in this? And what did they think of her in terms of her abilities to help whatever the particular goal was?
Right. Hannah Senesh is a young woman from Budapest. She grows up in a fairly upper middle class, like fairly comfortable family. Her dad, the playwright who I mentioned, Bela Senesh, quite a well-known name in Hungary. He had died when she was a kid. And she's this very she's a recognizable character, if you know, smart, Jewish girls. She's at the top of her class and she loves to read and she's great at writing and she directs the class play and she's she thinks of herself as Hungarian and she wants to be a novelist in Hungarian. That's what she writes in her diary, which she keeps very assiduously. And by the end of the 1930s, she, like many other Jews, realizes that this is not happening, that Jewish life in Europe is not going to be possible and that things are actually very dangerous. And she has this line in her diary. In her diary, she's constantly writing, I want to be a novelist. I dream of being a novelist. When will I be a novelist? I pray to God for literary talent. Like she's constantly writing this in her diary. And then one day, I think it's 1938, she doesn't write, I have become a novelist. She writes, I have become a Zionist.
Mm.
And she has this something clicks and she starts paying less attention in school and instead studying Hebrew. And in 1939, she manages to get an immigration certificate to Palestine, which was hard to get. And she gets out basically at the very last minute. It's the fall of 1939. And she moves to the land of Israel. She leaves her mother alone in Budapest, and that becomes a big deal for her later on. She makes it to Israel. She studies at an agricultural school for girls at Nahalal. I don't know if that's a Hadassah project. It wouldn't surprise me. It was a very it's a kind of a classic Zionist feminist project. She's there for 2 years, and then she joins a commune, a kibbutz called Sdot Yam, which means fields of the sea, which you can visit today. There's a museum dedicated to Hannah Senesh there. So, and she's there for a few years, and then she's drafted. She's kind of noticed by the people who are running this mission, and they understand that this is a very talented person. She speaks, according to her agent file, which I've seen in the Haganah archive, where I spent a lot of time. She speaks 5 languages. She's a classic European, like she speaks tons of languages, and she's proficient. Really, in a way that's quite remarkable. And they write that she is the best candidate from her country. The country is Hungary, and a lot of the parachutists are Hungarian, and she's the best. So she is taken for parachute training. Then she's sent to Cairo, which is also British at the time, for radio training, for training in Morse code. So she's a trained radio operator. And then in the spring of 1944, she's flown over Yugoslavia by a British bomber and dropped. And she's met on the ground by Tito's communist partisans in the forests of Yugoslavia. And that's where the story of Hannah starts developing to its to its tragic end at the very end of 1944. But she's a remarkable character. And if you grew up with Hannah Senesh and Arielle, then you might think that she is kind of like Davy Crockett or some kind of ludicrous poster child that doesn't make any sense when seen through modern eyes. But that's really an injustice to Hannah. She is an absolutely unbelievable character, and she left us so much writing that we can really put together who she was. If you read her diaries, you see someone with an unbelievable writing ability. She was incredibly talented, and she was very young, so she wasn't quite there yet. But had she been given a few more years, she would have been something. I mean, we would know her name, I think, either way. That's my that's my sense. I think she probably would have been a successful writer. She picks up Hebrew really quickly. Within a year of Aliyah, she's writing poems in Hebrew. And 3 years after her Aliyah, she writes the poem that we call Eli Eli, which she called Halicha Caesarea, or the walk to Caesarea. This is a very young woman who'd moved to Israel not long before, and she was already proficient in Hebrew. So she had many, many talents, and some of them were put to use in this mission. Although I guess it's important to say that in military terms, Hannah Senesh achieves absolutely nothing. So her talents weren't really those of a commando. She wasn't really a highly proficient intelligence operative. She had other talents, and we remember her for reasons that are unconnected to what she actually achieved as a soldier.
Mm. Another woman who you talk about extensively is Chaviva Reik. another one of the female parachutists, and you include an interesting description of this book, Members of the Kibbutz, which was written by a group of pioneer women trying to make sense of their kibbutz life, which, of course, we forget how difficult it was in pre-state days. And she's clearly inspired by this book because she carries it with her on her mission. So, what was her? She was a very different person than Hannah, but what was her unique role?
Chaviva Reich is an amazing character. It's interesting that that they come out of this really Hadassah like world. These women. I mean, this is the world of pioneer women. It's not a coincidence that two of the best known heroes of the mission are women. That was part of what was going on. So they come out of this world where there's the Zionist revolution going on, and there's also a feminist revolution going on. And my grandmother was a volunteer for Hadassah in the 40s, and this is part of the thing. Chaviva is inspired by this book which you mentioned, which is called in Hebrew HaChaverot BaKibbutz, the members of the kibbutz, but members feminine, because Hebrew is gendered, of course. So and it's about these heroic women who are, tilling the field and milking the cows and building the kibbutz and doing guard duty. And it's really inspiring to her. It's so inspiring to her that she takes the book to the mission. She takes it to Egypt for her training, and then she takes it into Europe, and she has it in her knapsack when she's infiltrated into Slovakia. And she actually has it with her until the very end when she's forced to give it up in a kind of a dramatic scene. She basically has to give up this feminist manifesto from which she draws inspiration. Chaviva is a different character than Hannah. They're kind of paired often because they're the two female characters of the mission, but they're very, very different. Hannah is upper middle class. Chaviva is working class. She came from a pretty scrappy family in Slovakia. Her dad had disappeared when she was young, and she had been working since she was a kid. She actually worked as a motorcycle messenger. So there are these great pictures of Chaviva, like a teenage Chaviva Reich, riding a motorcycle around rural Slovakia. And she moves to Israel. She doesn't really play by the rules, Chaviva. She has a very complicated love life. So she's divorced, but she never technically actually divorces her husband. He's still kind of in the background, but they're not together. And she has multiple relationships with different people at the same time. Some of them married, including one of the other parachutists. So I interviewed the woman who's in charge of the archive at Chaviva's kibbutz. It's a kibbutz called Ma'anit, which is not far from like Hadera in Israel. And the archivist Rina, who's 84 now, she grew up with people who knew Chaviva, and she said that everyone on the kibbutz did what they were supposed to do, and Chaviva did what she wanted to do, and they didn't like her for that reason. She was a kind of a rebellious character who didn't accept the norms of the time, and she was also a bit older than Hannah. She was 30, which seemed old, I guess, at the time. Hannah again was 22 at the beginning of the mission. So Chaviva is a very different character. But when the other parachutists discuss their accomplishments, they tend to mention Chaviva as the most effective of the parachutists, the best in terms of actual accomplishments on the ground. She ends up in a partisan enclave surrounded by fascist forces in Slovakia, actually in the town where she was born, and where she grew up. And many of the characters here have tragic ends, including Chaviva Reich. But she's an incredible character who's kind of been in the shadows of Hannah Senesh, I think, because the myth making machinery decides that Hannah is going to be the symbol of the mission. So it's Hannah's name that we know, and Chaviva much less so today. And that's a bit unjust, even though in the book I try to explain exactly why that happens, and there is a logic. There is a logic to it.
Mm. So one of Hannah's second, probably most famous poems is translated as "Blessed is the Match." And I have to tell you that even before we were talking about doing this program, my husband was going through my late mother-in-law's files, and he found a pamphlet from a Hanukkah program at the University of Pennsylvania in 1949 that included a reading of Hannah's poem, Blessed is the Match. And a
Wow.
description in the pamphlet says that Hannah became a symbol of strength and courage to Israeli soldiers, and her poem became their inspiration. So it's amazing to me that just a few years after the war, right, her heroism had already spread around the Jewish world. So there's a very interesting story that you tell about how this poem made it out of Europe when she didn't. So can you share that story?
That's an amazing anecdote. It is very surprising. I was very surprised to discover how quickly that poem becomes part of the myth. I mean, it's published. It's already published in 1944 in Israel. 1944, Hannah is captured in June 1944. And the poem is published in Israel. And there's a movie made about illegal immigration to Israel. It's a movie called The Illegals, and it comes out in 1947. So we're just 2 years after the war. And the Ma'apilim, these Jewish refugees trying to make it to Palestine illegally, are already singing this song, which has been put to music. So it happens immediately. And the way the poem, which in Hebrew is called Ashrei HaGafru, I have a little section in my book about how blessed is a match is, I think, a mistranslation of the poem, but we can talk about that after if you want. But the poem almost doesn't make it. And the story is that Hannah and one of her comrades they're on the border between Yugoslavia and Hungary one night in early June 1944. Hannah is about to cross the border into Hungary, which is under full Nazi occupation. And her comrades in Yugoslavia have been trying to convince her not to go because they understand that if she crosses the border into Hungary, she's unlikely to return. And they're right. She's going to cross the border and they'll never see her again. And they're trying to talk her out of it. And she's explaining to them that she has to go. Also because her mother is trapped in Budapest. Another figure in Budapest at the same time is Adolf Eichmann, who's planning and executing the destruction of the Hungarian Jewish community. So she feels that she needs to get to her mother. She feels that she has to do something. And she tells one of her comrades, even if I don't succeed, the Jews in Hungary will hear that I tried to get to them and they'll be inspired by that. So she has this very literary sensibility about what she's doing. Like, this might not work in practical terms, but the story of what I'm doing means something. So they're about to part in the forest. It's nighttime on the border, and she shakes the hand of this other parachutist whose name is Reuven Daphne, and he gives us this account. He feels that she's pressing into his hand a folded piece of paper. And it's this incredibly cinematic or literary scene where the heroine is kind of going off on her quest, and she leaves a last message to be read after her departure. I mean, if you know literature, if you've ever seen, a play of this kind, if you know about the hero's quest, then it all makes sense. But he doesn't. He doesn't like it. He thinks it's ludicrously theatrical, and he's so angry about it that he throws it away. She walks off, never to be seen again by them. And he throws this note away. Doesn't even open it. And he walks off back to the partisan camp, which is not far away, a place called Kalnik. And then he regrets it about an hour later, according to his account, and he realizes that he probably shouldn't have thrown away this last message from Hannah Senesh, and he goes back into the forest to look for it. And it takes him a while. He's kind of like, looking around in the bushes, and he manages to find this folded piece of paper, which I actually just saw recently. It's about the size of an index card. It's kept at the ghetto fighters kibbutz in northern Israel, the Lochamei. So it's about the size of an index card, and he opens it, and on this card are 4 lines written in Hebrew, and it is that poem, which is Hannah Senesh's second most famous poem. The most famous, of course, is Eli Eli. This is the second most famous poem, and it starts with that line that says, Ashrei hagafrur shenisraf v'hetzit lehavot, which I would translate, happy is the match that flared and lit the flames. Happy is the match that flared and lit the flames. And it's an incredible line, and it tells us exactly what Hannah Senesh thinks she's doing. She's going to cross the border. She is going to be burned. She's the match. And that act of being burned is going to light the flames. It's the story of the match, or the after effects of her being burned are going to cause a conflagration that she wants. And she says in that line, Ashrei comes from the same Hebrew root as Osher, which is happiness. She's saying she's happy to do this. So in some ways it's a suicide note. In some ways it's a last will and testament. It's an explanation of how Hannah Senesh understood this mission. She didn't really think that she was going to save the Jews. How could she save the Jews? I mean, she's one 22-year-old woman, and she didn't think she was going to defeat the Wehrmacht. she saw what she was doing as a story that would inspire other people to action. So that's why I think that the mission did not fail. We've just misunderstood the mission. She had a different idea of what she was doing.
Hmm. I'm actually going to quote a little something that I was wanting to reference in context of what you're just saying there, where you write that she grasps what the real mission is. The parachutists aren't commandos, they're storytellers. They've been sent to write with their lives a Zionist story about the war, a story that will lead others not to despair but to action. When faced with tragedy, those who know the parachutist story won't pull the covers over their head or bemoan the cruelty of their fate or wait for someone else to do something. They will look out into the night, grip the sides of the door, and jump. So that actually relates to a question that we have from the audience from Libby. She says Hannah Senesh was one of several Yishuv-based parachutists, but her fame seems to have subsumed her fellow paratroopers. So is it because primarily of her poetry and exactly this point that you're making, that she was the writer that survived and didn't get consumed?
It's such a great question. And Hannah's comrades asked the same question after the war because the whole mission becomes Hannah Senesh, but there were 31 other parachutists, and all of whom were quite heroic, and many of whom thought that they were not less heroic than Hannah Senesh. 7 of them are killed. So Hannah Senesh is one of 7 to be killed on the mission, but we really only remember her. So it's Libby, you're not the only person who's noticed that that's a bit weird, and actually some of her comrades are quite rankled by the way that Hannah's myth expands to kind of consume everything about the mission. There's a memorial ceremony or kind of there's a ceremony to kind of mark the parachutist mission held at Sdot Yam, which is the kibbutz that Hannah Senesh is from. And when they arrive, all the parachutists who survived and their families, they show up at this kibbutz, and there's a sign up that says Hannah and her friends, Hannah v'chavereha, Hannah and her comrades. So they'd been demoted to like Hannah's comrades. They didn't even have names. So it's very weird, especially since Hannah doesn't have any military accomplishments. It's not like she defeated a battalion of German soldiers or saved 1,000 Jews or something. She didn't save a single Jew or kill a single German. So why do we remember Hannah Senesh? And I think the key to the mystery is the realization that this mission was never military as much as it was literary. The mission was meant to tell a Zionist story about the Holocaust, because the Zionist movement can't live with the Holocaust, which is a story of Jewish weakness in the Zionist understanding of it. Of course, there's incredible Jewish strength in the Holocaust. It just doesn't look like strength as the Zionist movement understands it. But they need a story about heroism. They can't have a story about Jews being marched off by their millions to gas chambers. They need a different story in which Jews are wearing uniforms and jumping out of airplanes and carrying weapons. And this story is going to change not the present, because the Zionist movement can't change the present, but it's going to change the future by telling a different story about this war, and it works. I mean, like you were saying, Lisa, a few years later, this story inspires the Jewish soldiers who win the War of Independence and create a Jewish state. So that's what it's supposed to do. It's a storytelling mission. It's not a military mission. And the best storyteller was Hannah Senesh, because she was a great writer. And she not only wrote beautiful poetry and kind of put into words what the mission was, and she did it with the poem that we just read with "Happy Is the Match," and she writes "Eli Eli," and she has other poems that we still know and read. It's not just that she wrote it most beautifully; she also enacted the role of the heroine best. That scene in the forest is an example of it. She understands how a heroine behaves in a quest. She knew what's expected of the main character in the movie. And that scene in the forest is in many ways being directed by her. I mean, she kind of creates this cinematic scene because she understands what a heroic quest looks like. And she knows that because she's a bookworm, because she grew up going to her father's premieres at the theater in Budapest. She's the most adept storyteller. And that's why she's the one we remember, when the others who might have been more proficient militarily, they serve the storytelling purpose less well.
Hmm. So I wonder, given that you don't use her name in the title, which most other books about this mission and her certainly use the name in the title, and the fact that you do devote considerable space in the book to some of the other individuals involved, was that kind of your own way of trying to, rescue their names from history?
Right. And it's funny, in Hebrew, the book came out in Hebrew at the same time, and the publisher made it clear Hannah Senesh's name will be on the cover of the book. There was no debate about it. Like, that's a name that people want to read about. In Hebrew, the book does have Hannah Senesh's name, but in English, I mean, a few things. I think that most people today do not actually know who Hannah Senesh was. So that's a name that doesn't mean anything. I remember speaking, I guess it was 2 years ago, to a group of, it was like a Jewish mission from Phoenix. Like, these are involved people, educated people, about, I guess, 25, ranging in age from, I would say, 30s to 60s. And I was working on this book, so I asked them about Hannah Senesh. They had never heard of Hannah Senesh. And I said, Eli, Eli, nothing. Like, no recognition whatsoever. So I realized that putting Hannah Senesh's name on the cover doesn't necessarily do what it might have done 50 years ago. But yes, I also wanted to give the other characters a chance to breathe. And when I started working on the book, actually, one of the things that I wanted to do was reduce the role of Hannah. There are 32 parachutists. She's one of them. Okay, but let's see what the other people have to offer. And that was really something that I was trying to do at the beginning. And then as I was writing, her character just expanded and expanded and expanded because she's so great. And there's a reason that she's the heroine. I mean, I understand, everything that I said about military accomplishments, it's all true, but there is a reason that Hannah Senesh is the character that we remember. And eventually I kind of surrendered to it and surrendered to her. So if you read the book, you'll see that, it's not only about Hannah Senesh by any means, but she gets more screen time than the others.
We have another question. Is Hannah Senesh's diary published?
Absolutely, it's published. It was published immediately after the war. Again, the kind of myth making machinery goes into action right after her execution at the end of 1944, and her diaries and letters and poems are published. I think it's 1940. I don't want to get this wrong, but it's in the 1940s, certainly in Hebrew. Marie Sirkin, who is a writer who is well known in the post-war years, writes a book which I believe is called "Blessed is the Match." Yes, that's the name of the book, citing that poem. And that book comes out also in 47, 48. So it starts happening very quickly. So the diaries are published right after the war, and they're available in English. I don't know when the last edition was published. Hannah was a big deal for a while, and then becomes thought of kind of as a Zionist caricature, and everyone's too, cynical to really love Hannah Senesh, and we start hearing about her less. But the diaries are certainly available in the 1950s and 1960s in English, and you can still find them. I found when I was writing the book that many of the translations of the diary are inaccurate. So the translators back in those days took a lot of liberties, and there are sections that are left out. A lot of sections that would have undermined the Zionist mythology were kind of censored a bit. Nothing too dramatic, but there's a lot of places where it's clear that she's on this kibbutz and she's absolutely miserable. Like, she doesn't want to wash the pots, and it's just drudgery, and she's not cut out for it, and she hates manual labor, and that wouldn't work because Hannah Senesh was supposed to be a Zionist poster child. So she's always smiling, and she's happy to work, and she's a socialist, and so it's kind of her image is kind of airbrushed, and so is the diary. I would love to see a new edition of Hannah's writing. That would correct the problems in the translation, that would retranslate the poems. That would be really, really valuable. It would be amazing to see that. Maybe someone can make it happen.
Mm. So somebody else is asking why you refer to them as characters, as in Habibi
Mm.
was an interesting character. This term makes them seem like they're fictional rather than individuals in a nonfiction book. Is this related to your own hesitation about calling the work truly nonfiction?
Right. It's a great question. I mean, I think of them as characters because I lived with them for years, and they're characters in my book, but I also sometimes think of real people as characters. You'll say of someone that they're a real character or a great character, and I guess it's just a kind of a literary way of thinking about thinking about people. They're very real. I mean, the book is nonfiction. There's nothing in it that I made up. It's all based on on archival research. So there's no fact in the book that I can't back up with some document, but I do realize that that's not the same as saying this is a completely accurate portrayal of everything that happens. Of course not. And I want to think that if the characters, again, I'm using the word characters, I want to think that if these people read the book, they would recognize it as a genuine attempt to understand the heart of their story. But would they agree with my take on their adventure? Absolutely not. I mean, if you've ever had something that you were involved in written about by someone else, if you go to an event and then it's written up in the paper the next day, you're almost certain to say, what the hell is this? Like this bears no resemblance to anything that actually happened. My guess is that they might have that response to reading the book, but I do hope that they would recognize someone who's honestly trying to understand them as heroes. I'm not judging them harshly. I'm not trying to shatter the mythology. I'm trying to genuinely understand what made them tick and why they did this absolutely incredible thing that we're still talking about 80 years later. I mean, these were fantastic people. They really were heroes. They did something totally crazy that we, I think, find very hard to understand. And the goal of saving Jews and fighting the Nazis failed. The mission is a failure, but the dream of a revolution in Jewish history is a success. And it happens to some extent because of them.
So we're actually going to go over a couple of minutes because there's so much more to talk about, but I do want to shift focus for just a few minutes. And that is, you already talked about how your thinking about the book changed after October 7th, just when you were, digging deep into the research and not having begun the writing yet, I assume. So I do want to know how you think some of the themes of the book resonate today, given the war, the darkness, angst that Israelis are experiencing with anti-Semitism flaring around the world. We talked about it a little bit at the beginning. Do you see a through line here?
Yes. Yeah, I do. And I think that the last few years have shown us the limitations of the success that we thought we'd achieved. And I mean, there have been real successes. Of course, you can't dismiss all the great achievements of American Jewish life, and you can definitely not dismiss the incredible accomplishments of Israel in turning essentially a refugee camp into one of the world's most successful countries. So I'm not saying nothing was accomplished, but we're still a very, very small people. There aren't very many of us, and much of the world has a completely deranged approach to us and to our culture and to our existence. And it has never been more evident, or certainly not since the end of the Second World War. So, the world that these characters had to face has something to teach us about today, and their response to that world, I think, very much has something to teach us, because a lot of people are trying to figure out how to deal with the fact that we can no longer trust institutions that were central to Jewish identity in North America. For example, the New York Times, Columbia University, Harvard University, the Democratic Party. I mean, this is all changing really, really fast. So what do we do? And it can cause a feeling of helplessness, and it can cause a real feeling of depression. But the Zionist movement already answered all of these questions, and they offered a solution that, again, is a partial solution. I mean, Israel did not solve the problem. It's just a buffer against the problem for those of us who live here. But Zionism has an answer to Jewish helplessness, and it has an answer to what you need to do when your place in society erodes. And Herzl is dealing with this in 1895. And he's an incredible person to read about now. There's a great biography of Herzl called Herzl by Amos Elon, which came out in the early 70s. It's a wonderful book. It's one of my favorite books, and it's so modern. I mean, if you read about Herzl in Vienna in the 1890s, it sounds like New York in 2026. And he's a very successful journalist. He writes for the New York Times of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and he's assimilated, and he's upwardly mobile, and everything changes. And he realizes that he completely misunderstood everything. And he sits down in a hotel room in Paris and he writes a different story about the Jewish future. And the story is called The Jewish State. And it's a different program for how we're going to deal with it. And it's an insane idea in 1895, except I'm sitting in the state right now and speaking to you from the state. So Zionism understands that you can change the future, and stories are very powerful things, and you can change your fate. And the key is action. The key is responding to catastrophe with action, not collaboration, not denial, but action. And Israel is proof that works. And our characters are maybe the most pure embodiment of the instinct, almost divorced from any real world effects. I mean, it's pure action. In 1944, they act knowing not only that they're unlikely to succeed, they know they're unlikely to return. And yet, the Zionist instinct says you act, and if you don't return, your story will be told, and the match will light a flame, and it will have an effect on your children who will they'll live as free Jews in their own country. And that works. And that works. And it's worth remembering in 2026. It's still true. The problems are still here, and the Zionist answer is still the right one.
So one example that you wrote about very recently in terms of the problem plaguing the Jews and society in general was an article that you published in the Free Press just a few days ago. It was based on your discovery in several bookstores while you were in the States recently, the many new books about Gaza, and the piece is titled Gazology. And it details what you call a new literary genre that, quote, refashions the ruins of Gaza into a metaphor for Jewish evil. So can you unpack this for a bit and tell us why it's so important in the context of what you were just saying?
Right. So the piece which came out in the Free Press, I think on a few days ago. Everything's very blurry, but it's an attempt to look at this really ballooning literary genre that I've been seeing in American or in Western, not just American bookstores. Where I mean, you should try this if you haven't already. If you go into your local bookstore, go to the Middle East section, and you're likely to see a massive amount of new books with Gaza in the title or Palestine. This is really an expanding genre that tries to understand evil in the world through the lens of Gaza. So generally, these are not journalistic descriptions of the war that we've seen in the last 2.5 years. These are authors who are doing something else entirely. Most of them are nowhere near Gaza or Israel, and they're kind of building an ideological system around Gaza, where Gaza can be used to make a point about feminism. Gaza, one of the books is called Palestine and Feminist Liberation, or Gaza can be used to make a point about the climate. One of the books is called The Destruction of Palestine is the Destruction of the Earth. And they make points about medical care, and they make points about racism, and they make points about imperialism and colonialism. And I mean, it's an entire thought system that's being built around this war, with the villain being the familiar villain in Western stories about the world, which is the Jew. And it's happening right now, and it's being published by mainstream publishers. It's being carried in your local bookstore. I promise if you go, you'll see it. People writing these books have won the Pulitzer Prize. They've won the National Book Award. It's big. And if we're looking at this changing climate facing Jews in America and in the West, this is one way of understanding it. I mean, students at universities in the next few years, if it's not happening already, will be assigned these books in the anthropology department, in the literature department, possibly in the medical school, the engineering school. They'll be asked to understand the problems of the world by looking at Jewish villainy as expressed through Gaza, through the genocide in Gaza, the destruction of Gaza, just the evil of the Israeli state as an embodiment of everything that's wrong with the Western world. So it's not something that's pretty to look at. It's quite disturbing. And I did not enjoy reading all the books that I had to read to write that article, but I think it's very important if we want to understand where things are going.
Mm. What's your assessment of the current situation with Iran and Hezbollah right now? What's been accomplished by the war? I know this is like kind of hard to get into this conversation so late in the conversation, but to just touch on, where are the ceasefires good or bad for Israel? What do you think comes next? You have a, journalistic, analytical mind that focuses on these issues when you're not writing books. What can you tell us?
The question of whether the ceasefire with Lebanon exists is a good one. I mean, Israel's been attacking here and there when they find Hezbollah fighters, and Hezbollah just launched a barrage into northern Israel, which is where my parents have lived in a town called Nahariya on the Lebanon border for many years. So the question of whether that ceasefire is going to hold is a good one. We're not sure. We're in this interim time where we don't quite understand what was achieved in Iran. Maybe a lot, maybe not enough. We don't know. I think that all the people rushing to conclusions about the campaign in Iran are really, it's too soon. We'll only be able to understand what was achieved in a year or two. And I think most Israelis would love some normalcy. I mean, I think the idea that we're going to defeat every single enemy in the Middle East is not really realistic. And people have had a really, really rough 2.5 years. We've lost hundreds and hundreds of soldiers. The country's in bad shape internally in terms of our, domestic politics. We have an election coming up, which needs to be resolved. So I think most Israelis would be happy for a period of prolonged quiet. I don't want to say peace, but a period of prolonged quiet that would allow us to kind of put the pieces back together, get organized on our domestic situation, maybe elect a more constructive government in the fall. The challenges are not going anywhere. They're going to be there after the election, but I think there's a limit to how much the society can be on a war footing. This is a very small place, and we have a very small military force that's really taxed beyond its limit. So like most Israelis, I'm praying that this period of relative quiet can be prolonged for as long as possible.
Mm. So we know, and this term is very much often overused, that we know we're a resilient people, and the Israelis have certainly proven that again and again in the past few years. But what hope can you offer us? What note of hope? Is it that there might be a change of course, or what do you say?
I certainly hope that we have a change of course politically, but in a deeper sense, and this sounds strange, my hope comes from reading and studying Jewish history, and it comes from stories like this one, which sounds crazy because we're talking about the Holocaust, we're talking about tragedies, and what's hopeful about that. What's hopeful is that if you look at where we were at the time of this mission and look at where we are now, we've been lucky to live through a revolution in the lives of Jews across the world. And it's true that the direction is not positive. And it's true that the high point for American Jews is probably behind us. And I think that we need to kind of be clear-eyed about all of that. But we have this state, which is an anomaly in history. It's really the Jewish hack of history, and a state that was just a dusty refugee camp full of people who spoke completely different languages, had nothing to do with each other. Jews from Morocco, Jews from Poland, Jews from Yemen. Surrounded by enemies, impoverished, coming out of the worst genocide in history. And if you've been to Israel recently, even during the war, you see this incredible, energetic Jewish society that's, alive and kicking. So if you've seen that happen in 80 years, how could you not be optimistic about the future? We can do anything. I mean, and I'm not saying that as someone of religious faith, and this isn't an expression of like messianic belief, or I'm just a guy who reads Jewish history and lives in Israel. And you go to Tel Aviv, and how did this happen? And if that could happen, then really anything could happen if we have the right leaders and the right ideas. And the Israelis are incredible, and the Jewish people are incredible. Most nations don't have this kind of human capital and this kind of commitment, which is expressed through organizations like Hadassah, which you can take for granted because it's been around for so long. Most countries don't have that. It's very, very unique to be that committed to each other. And the commitment is expressed through, something as seemingly, small as logging onto a Hadassah Zoom or organizing, a dinner like my grandmother would do in the 40s. But it's the same instinct that brings Hannah Senesh back to Hungary, because other Jews are in danger. So she's safe, but she will go back because she feels a commitment to her people. And you can take that for granted, but we shouldn't. And it's a battery that can power us through a lot of adversity, as it has done over the past 2.5 years. And I think there's, it's funny to say this at a dark time, but I think we have every reason for for optimism. It's not going to be easy, but I do think that it'll be okay.
That's a really good note to end on. Matti, thank you so much for this timely and meaningful conversation. I really appreciate it. Before we say goodbye, I want to announce that our next Hadassah Magazine Presents will be on Tuesday, May 19th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, when I'll be joined by our very own culinary star, Adina Sussman, whose latest cookbook is Zariz, 100 Easy Breezy Tel Avivi Recipes. She will talk about her journey in creating this cookbook in the aftermath of the Hamas attacks and how she felt the need, both spiritual and practical, to streamline her time in the kitchen. And she shares all those recipes with us. And anyone who's seen her with us before or elsewhere knows that we talk a lot about food, but also so much more. So be sure to register for that. We'll also once again have a special giveaway with her book. Anyone registering to attend the virtual program will automatically be entered to win one of 3 free copies of Zariz that we're giving away. So a link to register for the program is in the chat box. It's on the hadassahmagazine.org website and will be a follow-up email to this program, which will also include a link to the podcast episode of this interview with Matti Friedman. And you can also find links to purchase Matti's Out of the Sky in the chat box, and I highly recommend that you do. All that information will be in a follow-up email as well. And speaking of giveaways, the time has come to announce our lucky winners of a free copy of Matti's book. The winners are Miriam Khan and Robin Rubin. So you will hear from our producer, Arielle Kaplan, in the next few days about how to receive your book. I want to thank Arielle, the magazine's digital editor, who both promoted and produced the program, and Leah Finkelstein, our senior and book editor, who helped plan and implement this program. And as always, a shout out to our partners in Hadassah's engagement and marketing and communication divisions, who always play an important role in making these programs happen. Thanks again, Matti, for being with us for this insightful conversation and for continuing to shed light on important stories from the past and the present.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thanks to everyone for joining us. From all of us at the magazine, we wish everyone a happy, safe, and peaceful spring. Until next time, goodbye.